Moving right along now and on to markets. And on Wednesday, I was joined by Darin Fessler of Lakefront Futures and Options. He offered his take on next week's WASDE report and the market reaction to Hurricane Ida. But I began by getting a closer look at how this year's crop is looking and what we can expect as harvest ramps up.
I could go to parts of Lancaster County. They're very, very good. I go to Seward County, where in the dryland parts of Seward County, they obviously are a 180-degree difference between what Lancaster and Seward is. The models are still showing around that 175 on corn, upwards of that 50.5 to 51 on the beans. Now, granted, the models have been very, very consistent over the last 2 to 3 weeks, even though my bias, I'm looking at it with my own two eyes. How do we get to this 50 bushel? So, people kind of wondering, how are we continuing to decline here when we have these sales, when we have the weather issues on the beans? And I think it's a multitude of things here. Because one, if we look at the export sales, we are not on the pace for what the USDA projections are. And with the disruptions of Ida, slowing some exports down at the Gulf, we have to wonder, okay, are we going from a 140, 150 carryout to potentially a 250 carryout by December? But really, I think overall, I think this crop is good, but not great.
And Darin, you touched on Hurricane Ida. Talk to me a little bit more about the biggest impacts we're seeing there and the pressure that it's putting on the markets.
Yeah, as long as there's disruptions, power outages being the big one. Obviously, there's some infrastructure damage that has taken place. It's going to slow those exports down the Mississippi, and we're going to see some of that routed towards the PNW. That's already been talked about. But the idea, the perception that we slow down these exports would only backlog, or with the idea that we only increase our carryout. So that has a negative tone to this market. Not only that, but the Ida is putting another pressure on the market that we've already seen internally. Internally, if we look at the open interest or the number of contracts being floated out there over the last several weeks, corn, beans, wheat, we've seen a decline in open interest. And granted, I think that is a combination of things that's happening. One, we have seasonal tendencies that are bearish right now. We have a hurricane that disrupted the export demand, and we have a technical picture currently that is turning bearish. I think the funds do not want to hold the type of positions to the long side into what could potentially be a decent crop, but we also have some risk here in the market where I think that, funds want to kind of move to the sideline a little bit. I don't think they get short, but I do think they want to lighten up on their long side of their position here. And I do think that in itself, we're below the 100-day on both the corn and the beans. That's another sign that the funds moving to the sideline here are at least lightening up on that long side.
And could you talk to me about corn and soybean basis and what changes we could be seeing in that as harvest ramps up?
Well, what we've seen in basis here so far, we've seen a collapse in the old crop basis. Not to be shocker by any means. I do think that we're not going to have a huge supply issue. Maybe the market had perceived earlier on this summer, where we did see quite a bit more strong basis. Now, what's going to be very interesting here, if we get out here and say early October, mid-October, and producers saying, boy, these crops just aren't there. Now, I think it's going to be a very localized issue where bases will be remaining strong. Now, granted, areas in North Dakota, yes, they've received recent rains, but the crop is what the crop is up there. Now, I believe the bases in those areas of the country are going to remain strong. Now, there's areas in Nebraska where once we get out there, we're probably going to see a weaker basis or much more of a normalized basis here. But I do think that I don't think we're going to go back to these minus 30, 40 bases, or, say, let's say 10 to 20 basis lower than what we historically would see this time of year. I do think we see relatively strong basis or historically, but I don't think it's going to collapse by any means.
And Darin, September WASDE on tap for next week. What are you watching for?
Well, one thing is, I think that we really have to hone in on these bean exports. Again, we are below the projections that we're having. I do think because of these Ida issues that we've dealt with in Louisiana, we're going to continue to deal with over the next few weeks, how does the USDA handle this when it looks at, are we going to 200 or 250 carry out on the beans? I think that's very, very important. Where does the stocks use ratio fall in corn and beans? If corn gets under 7%, I do think we maintain this really choppy trade between, let's call it 520 and 580 to the upside. Granted, I'm going to continue to recommend my producers be 70% sold or hedged on new crop corn, 60% currently on new crop beans. I do think there's a lot of risk in these markets, but keep in mind, where there's risk, there is going to be opportunities, especially if on reownership when I look at these option prices.
And as we look ahead a few more weeks, what do you think we might see with that quarterly grain stocks report at the end of the month?
Well, with the quarterly stocks, now there's going to be a lot of assumption that because of what had happened last year with the ratio, maybe we don't have the supply, and maybe we don't. The basis has been relatively strong the whole year, but what has happened recently with the basis kind of leads me to believe that we're not going to get a super bullish report in that quarterly stocks. And I think the same thing on the beans. So I think right now where the market's attention is, I think the attention right now is on outside markets. And I do think if we go along here, how does harvest progress? And with that, how does the Brazilians start off planting? Do they get it off in the ground going pretty good? And I do think the Brazilians will be fine. Once they get to the rainy season, we'll have to see, knock on wood. Hopefully those guys get some rain as well.